I want to begin with a simple question that sounds almost uncomfortable. What if many of the limits you believe in are not facts at all, but habits of thought? For decades, psychology has shown us something both unsettling and liberating, that the human mind is not an objective reporter of reality. It is a storyteller, and very often it tells stories that quietly hold us back. Your mind lies to you not out of malice, but out of efficiency. It prefers certainty over curiosity, categories over nuance, and familiarity over awareness. When we stop paying attention, the mind fills in the gaps automatically. We label experiences as good or bad, people as able or unable, ourselves as too old, too late, or not the type. These labels feel true because we repeat them, not because they are accurate. In my research on mindfulness, I've seen again and again that when people become actively engaged with the present moment, when they notice new things rather than relying on old assumptions, their performance, health, and sense of possibility change. The body responds differently. The mind opens. What we once believed was fixed suddenly becomes flexible. This tells us something profound. Many of the limits we accept are not biological or psychological necessities, they are mental habits. The mind lies most convincingly when it tells you that you already know. When you believe you know who you are, what you can do, or how the world works, you stop noticing. And when you stop noticing, you stop learning. Mindlessness feels safe because it is familiar, but it quietly narrows your life. Mindfulness, on the other hand, feels uncertain at first, yet it expands your options in ways you may not expect. Consider how often your mind says, "That's just the way I am," or "That's how it's always been." These statements sound like truth, but they are really conclusions drawn too early. Psychology shows us that when people are invited to see situations from new perspectives, even small shifts in attention can lead to measurable changes in behavior, motivation, and well-being. The mind that once insisted, "I can't," begins to ask, "What if?" Your mind also lies when it confuses confidence with correctness. Just because a thought is loud does not mean it is right. Just because a belief is old does not mean it is wise. When you pause and question your assumptions about age, ability, success, or failure, you create space for choice. And choice is where freedom lives. Most people move through life believing their limits are facts, when in reality they are habits formed by repetition. From a young age, the mind learns to draw conclusions quickly. What you are good at, what you are not, what is possible for you, and what is not worth trying. These conclusions feel solid because they have been rehearsed for years, but psychology shows us something uncomfortable and empowering at the same time. Familiar does not mean true. The mind mistakes repetition for reality, and over time, a habit of thought begins to look like an unchangeable law. If your limits were truly facts, they would not need constant reminding. Yet notice how often the mind repeats them. "I'm not that kind of person. I can't change at this age. I've always been this way." Facts do not argue for themselves. Habits do. The mind keeps repeating these statements not because they are accurate, but because they are automatic. And anything automatic can be interrupted. What you call a limitation is usually a conclusion drawn too early and never revisited. The problem is not that the mind reaches conclusions, it has to, but that it rarely goes back to question them. When you stop questioning, you stop noticing. And when you stop noticing, life becomes smaller without you realizing it. You begin to live inside a mental routine, responding the same way, expecting the same outcomes, and then mistaking predictability for truth. Another hook to consider: effort alone does not break limits. Awareness does. People often believe change requires force, more discipline, more motivation, more pressure. But research consistently shows that when people simply become more aware of how they are thinking, behavior shifts naturally. When you notice a limit as a thought rather than a fact, its power weakens. The moment you can say, "This is a habit of mind," instead of "This is who I am," you have already begun to change. The mind prefers stability over accuracy. That is why it clings to old labels even when they no longer serve you. Labels simplify the world, but they also shrink it. When you label yourself as bad at learning, not creative, or too late, you stop exploring evidence to the contrary. You do not fail because you are limited. You feel limited because you stopped exploring. Curiosity is not lost with age, it is lost with certainty. Limits survive best in environments where nothing new is noticed. The moment you deliberately notice small differences, new angles, alternative explanations, unfamiliar possibilities, the old limit begins to loosen. You do not need to overthrow your entire belief system. You only need to introduce doubt. And doubt in psychology is not weakness, it is an opening. Think about how often people say, "I know myself." What they usually mean is, "I know my past patterns." But you are not your past patterns unless you keep repeating them. When people become mindful, actively noticing new details in familiar situations, they often surprise themselves. Performance improves not because ability suddenly appeared, but because the mental box quietly dissolved. The most convincing lie the mind tells is that change requires becoming someone else. In reality, change often comes from seeing yourself differently. When you stop treating old conclusions as permanent truths, behavior shifts without struggle. Limits fall away not with force, but with flexibility. The mind that once insisted, "This is impossible," begins to ask, "Under what conditions might this be possible?" That single question changes everything. Your limits feel real because they have been rehearsed, protected, and rarely challenged. But psychology reminds us that the human mind is remarkably responsive to how it frames experience. When you treat limits as habits rather than facts, you stop fighting yourself and start learning about yourself. And learning, unlike limitation, has no fixed endpoint. Most people believe that change begins with effort, yet psychology repeatedly shows that change often begins with attention. Awareness is not passive observation, it is an active way of engaging with reality. When you become aware in new ways, outcomes shift, not because the world changes, but because your relationship to it does. This is where many people misunderstand transformation. They try to push harder, work longer, and discipline themselves more, while ignoring the quiet power of how they are paying attention. Doing more is often less effective than noticing more. When people operate on autopilot, they repeat behaviors without questioning them. Awareness interrupts this cycle. The simple act of noticing differences, subtle changes, new variables, alternative interpretations, activates parts of the mind that remain dormant under routine. The brain responds differently when it is engaged rather than habitual, and the body often follows. Research in psychology has shown that when individuals are encouraged to be mindful, measurable changes occur in performance, health, and well-being. These changes do not come from adding something external, but from removing mental blinders. Awareness allows you to see options that were previously invisible. What once felt exhausting becomes manageable, not because the task changed, but because the way it was approached did. Another hook worth sitting with is this: awareness is a form of intelligence in action. It sharpens perception and increases flexibility. When you are aware, you are less likely to react automatically and more likely to respond intentionally. This distinction matters. Automatic reactions are rooted in the past, intentional responses are shaped in the present. When people respond instead of react, outcomes improve across domains. From decision-making to emotional regulation to physical performance, the body itself responds to awareness. When attention is engaged, stress responses often decrease and efficiency increases. This is not abstract theory. It is observable in how people move, breathe, and recover. When you are mentally present, the body receives clearer signals. Tension that once seemed unavoidable loosens, and energy previously wasted on resistance becomes available for action. Awareness does not require time. It requires intention. Many assume they cannot be more mindful because they are too busy. Yet mindlessness takes just as much time as mindfulness. It simply produces poorer results. When you bring awareness into what you are already doing, you often find that tasks take less effort and yield better outcomes. Awareness also changes how you interpret feedback. Without awareness, feedback feels like judgment or failure. With awareness, it becomes information. This shift alone can transform motivation. People who view experiences as data rather than verdicts remain engaged longer, learn faster, and recover more quickly from setbacks. The difference is not resilience as a trait, but awareness as a practice. Perhaps the most powerful hook is this: awareness restores choice. When you are unaware, you feel trapped by circumstances, emotions, and habits. When you are aware, you see alternatives. You may not control everything that happens, but awareness gives you control over how you frame and respond to what happens. That framing shapes outcomes more than most people realize. Awareness also dissolves false urgency. When you are not present, everything feels rushed and overwhelming. When you are present, priorities become clearer. You distinguish between what truly requires action and what is merely noise. This clarity reduces cognitive overload and improves decision quality, allowing you to act with precision rather than panic. The impact of awareness is cumulative. Each moment of noticing reinforces flexibility, curiosity, and engagement. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where better attention leads to better outcomes, which in turn encourages even greater awareness. What looks like improvement from the outside is often, from the inside, simply a different way of paying attention. Most people assume that thoughts are instructions rather than events. When a thought appears, it feels authoritative, personal, and urgent, as if it must be acted upon. Yet psychology tells us something quietly radical. A thought is not a command. It is a mental occurrence. The moment you recognize this difference, your relationship with your inner world begins to change. Power does not come from controlling thoughts, but from no longer being controlled by them. The loudest thought is rarely the wisest one. The mind is designed to speak quickly, not accurately. It generates predictions, warnings, and interpretations based on past experiences, not present realities. When these mental messages go unquestioned, they shape behavior automatically. Fear sounds like caution. Doubt sounds like realism. Limitation disguises itself as common sense. Most internal dialogue is not chosen, it is inherited. It comes from previous experiences, cultural messages, and long-rehearsed interpretations. The problem is not that the mind produces these thoughts, but that we confuse familiarity with truth. When you believe every thought, you collapse the distance between observer and content. You do not have a thought, you become it. And in that fusion, choice disappears. Freedom does not require positive thinking. It requires accurate thinking. Trying to replace negative thoughts with positive ones often creates resistance. Observation, however, creates space. When you step back and notice a thought as a thought, its emotional charge weakens. You may still hear it, but you are no longer obligated to obey it. This shift alone can change how you respond to challenges, risks, and opportunities. The mind often lies by presenting predictions as facts. This will fail. You will regret this. You are not ready. These statements feel convincing because they arrive with emotion. But emotion is not evidence. When you learn to pause and ask, is this a certainty or a story, you interrupt the automatic loop. That pause is not hesitation. It is power. You gain control, not by silencing the mind, but by widening perspective. When you see a thought from multiple angles, rather than from inside it, you regain agency. You can acknowledge the thought without surrendering to it. This is not denial, it is discernment. Discernment allows you to choose action based on values instead of impulses. Believing every thought also narrows identity. People define themselves by what their mind repeatedly says. I'm anxious. I'm not confident. I always mess this up. Over time, these statements harden into identity claims. But identities built on unexamined thoughts are fragile. When you observe these narratives rather than accept them, identity becomes flexible rather than fixed. Thoughts lose authority when they are named. Saying, I am having the thought that creates distance without conflict. This linguistic shift signals to the mind that you are the observer, not the content. From this position, behavior becomes intentional. You can act despite fear, move forward despite doubt, and remain grounded despite uncertainty. The ultimate power of not believing every thought is choice. Choice over reaction, choice over avoidance, choice over self-limitation. When you stop treating thoughts as orders, you stop living on autopilot. You respond with awareness instead of reflex, and in that space between thought and action, your capacity to adapt, grow, and decide expands dramatically. So the goal is not to silence the mind, but to stop obeying it blindly. When you notice your thoughts instead of becoming them, you reclaim authorship of your life. You begin to see that many of the stories you have been living by are optional, and in that realization lies extraordinary power. If your mind has been lying to you, the good news is this: you do not need a new mind. You need a new relationship with it, one rooted in curiosity, awareness, and the willingness to see differently. Because the moment you do, the world and your place in it becomes far less limited than you were ever led to believe.